A few years ago, I heard one of the most useful language tips of my life, and my exact thought was, this person has no idea what they're talking about. I was watching one of those street interview videos, and they were stopping people on the sidewalk and asking a simple question. What's your number one tip for learning a language? And one woman answered without hesitating, reading. Here is my logic. If you sit there and read a language off a page, you have no clue what any of it actually sounds like. You're probably just making up pronunciations in your head as you go, and they're probably wrong. So in my mind, at least, all you'd be doing is drilling those wrong sounds over and over, cementing bad habits you'd have to undo later. Reading seemed like a great way to teach yourself a language incorrectly. So I wrote her off and moved on, kept all my focus on listening. Here's the thing though, that woman was right. And I was the one who had no idea what I was talking about. Now, my concern wasn't completely crazy. There's a real version of that pronunciation problem, and I'll come back to it because the way you solve it is honestly one of the most effective techniques I figured out in all my years of learning languages. But the bigger picture, I had it backwards. Reading turned out to be one of the biggest accelerators in my entire journey, and almost skipping it might have been the biggest mistake I could have made. So in this video, I want to show you exactly what I was missing, why reading is so much more powerful than it may seem on the surface, and why, if you're serious about actually getting fluent, it might be the most underrated tool you've got. So let me be clear about one thing up front. On this channel, listening always comes first. It's the foundation that trains your ear to the actual sounds of the language. If you only read, my original worry kind of comes true. You'd miss the whole sound side of the language. So reading was never meant to be the main event. But here's what I completely missed back then. Reading isn't supposed to stand on its own. Think of it like gasoline. On its own, a puddle of gas just sits there, doesn't really do anything. That's reading by itself. But take that same gasoline and pour it on a fire that's already burning, and it erupts. The fire grows way bigger, way faster than it ever could have on its own. The fire is your listening, the input you're already taking in every day. Reading is the gasoline. By itself, it's not much, but if you add it to a fire that's already going, it grows disproportionately. You don't get a little more progress, you get a lot more. So why does it work like that? What is reading actually doing when you add it to the mix? It comes down to two kinds of benefits, the ones that you'd probably expect and the ones that genuinely surprise me. Let's start with the obvious ones. If this reframe is already shifting how you think about reading, that's exactly what this channel is about, taking the stuff that actually moves the needle and showing you how to use it. This video is part of a whole series on reading, so subscribe and stick around so you don't miss the rest. Okay, back to it. So let's start with the benefits you'd probably guess on your own, the direct ones. These are real and they matter, but they're also the part most people already half expect, so we won't spend too much time on them. The biggest one is vocabulary. When you read, you run into far more words, more concentrated, than you do through listening alone. Think about it. In a normal conversation, people lean on the same few hundred words over and over. But in a book, an author is reaching for precise, varied language on every page. And you're exposed to words you just wouldn't come across only listening. And since those words are printed on the page in front of you and not in a fleeting audio, it's far less likely you miss it, even if it's unfamiliar. And with the built-in context of whatever you're reading, they actually stick. Then there's grammar and sentence structure. Here's the thing, I've never sat down and studied an Italian grammar rule from a book and enjoyed it. But reading let me absorb those same grammar patterns without the pain. When you see correct sentence structure over and over in context, your brain starts to internalize the patterns on its own. You stop thinking, where does this word go? And start to just feel when a sentence sounds right. The same way you do in English. You didn't really learn English grammar from a textbook either. You heard and read enough of it that it became automatic. And all of that rolls into better comprehension. More words, a stronger feel for how sentences fit together. You simply understand more of what you read and hear. These are the base benefits. They're exactly what you'd expect, but they're worth having. But honestly, they're not what changed my mind. The benefits that actually flipped me from skeptic to believer were the ones that I never saw coming. So let's get into those. Here's where it gets good, and here's what I never saw coming back when I dismissed the idea of reading to learn a language. The real power of reading isn't any of the stuff I just mentioned. It's that reading is the ultimate supplement to listening. Remember the gasoline in the fire? This is the part where they actually combine. Here's what I mean. When you're just listening, the language goes by fast. Native speakers blend words together, drop sounds, and talk a mile a minute. So there are words and structures flying past you that you can never fully catch. Your brain just lets them blur by because it can't lock onto them in real time. Reading freezes all of that. On the page, the sentence sits still. You can actually see where one word ends and the next begins. You can sit with a structure long enough to absorb it. All of those things that slip past your ear when you're listening, reading lets you finally pin them down. But here's the mechanism that genuinely flipped it for me, and it's the exact thing I was wrong about all those years ago. When you read and listen at the same time, same content, text and audio together, something powerful happens. Your brain starts wiring the written word directly to the real sound. You're looking at the word on the page and you're hearing exactly how a native speaker actually says it in the same instant. So instead of inventing some made up pronunciation in your head, which was my whole original fear, you're locking each word to its true sound. Think about what that does. My big worry was that reading would teach me words wrong, that I'd cement bad pronunciations I'd have to undo later. But it turns out when you pair reading with audio, the exact opposite happens. Reading stops being the thing that risks your pronunciation and becomes the thing that sharpens it. That problem I was so afraid of solved completely by the same activity I was afraid of. And that's the magic of it. You get every benefit of reading, all that vocabulary, all that structure, while at the same time training your ear and locking in real pronunciation. Reading and listening stop being two separate activities, and they become one that make each other better. That's the fire and the gasoline. Now, how do you actually do this? The exact way to pair text and audio to get this effect is honestly such a game changer that I'm giving it its own video later in the series. It's the technique I'd promised I'd come back to. So keep an eye out for that because it might be the most useful thing I show you in the whole series. So let's bring it back to where we started. Years ago, I heard someone say reading was their number one tip to learn a language, and I was so sure that they were wrong, I didn't give it a second thought. And that assumption cost me because reading turned out to be the thing that took my languages from slow and steady to accelerated and efficient. If there's one idea I want you to walk away with, it's this. Reading isn't a replacement for listening. It never was. But added to the listening you're already doing, it multiplies everything. More vocabulary, grammar you absorb without studying. And the one that flipped me, pronunciation gets sharper, not worse, when you pair the words with their real sounds. So if you've been treating reading as optional or skipping it the way I almost did, don't make my mistake. It might be the most underrated tool you've got. Now that you know why it matters, the rest of the series is about how to actually do it. What to read when you're just starting out, how to level up to real books without getting discouraged, and that text and audio technique I keep promising you, which honestly might change the whole way you learn. So subscribe and stick around for the rest, step by step, at your own pace, no textbooks, no stress.